know why you're here. This is an open meeting. This is the UK Independence Party, who wants to explain to people what it is that we stand for. And I think too many times you don't get the opportunity through the media to find out what we're all about. So this evening is one way of you doing exactly that. But you don't need a local chairman patting on. What you need is professional speakers. And our first speaker is a very well-known journalist. Mail, the Telegraph, I think he's the associate editor of the Daily Telegraph. It's Mr. Simon Heffer.
Ladies and gentlemen, I come among you, I think, according to David Cameron, as one fruitcake loony and closet racist among, I hope, a great number of fruitcakes, loonies and closet racists. I would be here tonight for that reason, if for no other. There is a tradition in this country, there are many traditions in our politics, but one of them is that whenever Nigel Farage stands for election for something, I come and speak for him. I'm his warm-up man, his freak show, I get people in. But even if there wasn't this long-standing tradition, which is now enshrined in our Constitution, I would have been brought here tonight by that one idiotic and stupid phrase of David Cameron's. For most of my life, when I've had a vote, I voted Tory. And on several occasions, I will be the first to admit, I voted for UKIP. But as a visceral conservative with a small c, I felt it was my bounden duty to come here tonight to speak on behalf of my old friend, who is a man of absolute integrity, and who has now, I think, for the last 7 years represented this region of England at Europe. So we don't have to, you don't have to take my word for it that Nigel Farage is a brilliant politician. You can see it for yourselves, you can see it in his enormous achievement as an MEP. And one of the most conspicuous parts of that achievement, and there's a lot to choose from, because you may have seen videos of Nigel on his feet in the European Parliament attacking corruption, attacking abuse, attacking graft, attacking dishonesty, and attacking the retreat from our democracy. But his greatest achievement of all over those 7 years is that he's never shown the slightest sign of going native. And believe me, when I've seen MEPs from other parties go to Brussels and to Strasbourg talking about how much they're going to reform the system, they're going to stop corruption and dishonesty and graft, and yet they all become a part of it within a few months. Nigel, 7 years down the line, I think is probably even more militantly against this revolting socialist corporatist ramp than he was when he went there. It might be glib to say it, but I'm here tonight fundamentally because I am a Conservative. As Enoch Powell said, I was born a Tory. He said it about him, but I'm saying it about me. And because I was born a Tory, I find myself deeply at odds with the present Conservative Party. I won't call it the Tory Party because it isn't a Tory party. It's lost that traditional reverence that Tories have for institutions, for tradition, for sovereignty. They've all gone. And when I look at Nigel's campaign literature, I see, unsurprisingly, a man who commits himself to what I've always regarded to be core Tory values, and who is a better Tory than the candidate who is standing in the Conservative interest in this constituency. There is manifestly no one more suited among the candidates who are standing to succeed Eric Forth, who was a man for whom I had a great regard, than Nigel. In fact, if anything, I think Nigel's probably a bit to the left of Eric Forth. But if the people of Bromley and Chislehurst want someone in Eric's mould, then they've got him. He's here. He has all Eric's integrity, all Eric's wit, all Eric's brains, all Eric's commitment, all Eric's conviction. And the man who is otherwise, I think, standing in the Conservative interest, who seems to have, among his many jobs, when he has time, to have devoted his political life to support of Europe and to the European cause in general is, I think, a complete break with what the electors of this constituency have been used to. But I'm also in no doubt that if Nigel were elected, he would take to Westminster that refreshing, no-nonsense, common-sense, plain-speaking approach that he has deployed to such effect in Brussels and Strasbourg. He would represent his constituents, I know, with enormous devotion and commitment. But more than that, more than just answering their requests and answering their questions, he would stand up in Westminster and stand up for them and speak for them. And in an age when the politicians, when MPs in the House of Commons are increasingly controlled by the whips of their parties and are increasingly subdued into a sense of obedience and compliance with what their parties want, for this constituency to have the chance to elect a man for UKIP who will go and do what he says he will do and without having to be controlled by anybody else when he's trying to do it, is a terrific opportunity for you. It's a terrific opportunity for you to strike a blow against the cowardice of organised politics and to choose somebody who actually stands up for what we all believe in as Britons and as patriots and as democrats. Well, sometimes thank you for that technological burst, that reminds me. Sometimes those of us who are on the traditional end of the Conservative spectrum are accused of not being very modern. Now, I am incredibly modern, and to prove it, I have one of these things, it's called a BlackBerry. And this allows me to receive emails on important subjects at all hours of the day and night, wherever I am. And I was having a particularly unmodern lunch today, when it buzzed, and an email came through on it. And I thought it was junk, but something made me open it. And I'm going to read it to you, because it sums up, much better than I can actually, why anyone in this constituency who is Conservative-minded should be voting for Nigel Farage and not for the official Conservative candidate. It is a press release from the Conservative Democratic Alliance. Release time immediate. And the headline is, Tory Pressure Group Disavows Cameron Leadership on Eve of Bromley by-election. And it says that at the quarterly meeting of the Council of the Conservative Democratic Alliance, an organisation which represents over 2,000 Conservative Party members and supporters, has expressed its complete rejection and disavowal of David Cameron's move to the left and his adoption of fundamentally anti-Conservative precepts. And they go on to give examples. 1. The refusal to recognise tax cuts as a precondition of economic stability rather than the reverse. 2. The pronouncement by Oliver Letwin that the party now believes in the redistribution of wealth, an essentially Marxist conception of economics. 3. The rejection of the reintroduction of grammar schools, and therefore the notion of competition at all levels of education. 4. The disgraceful acceptance of positive discrimination in the selection of parliamentary candidates. 5. The plan to introduce tax breaks for homosexual couples, thereby challenging the institution of marriage as the primary social unit of society. 6. Notwithstanding the public's very clear dislike of continuing mass immigration into the United Kingdom, effectively remaining silent and thereby demonstrating the worst type of political cowardice. 7. The weak and unsatisfactory approach to Britain's continued involuntary absorption into the European Union, in refusing to encourage even a debate about the merits and demerits of our continuing membership. And it goes on. Now, that is an eloquent statement, I think, by Conservatives of what has gone wrong with the so-called party of opposition on the right. Indeed, they could have added many other things. But I'm particularly appalled by David Cameron's stance on the European People's Party. Now, as some of you will know, it was decided some time ago to take Tory MEPs into this grouping, which is a federalist grouping which signs up to the breakup of nation states and the federalisation of regions within countries and of countries within the European Union. Cameron made a promise last November, before he was elected to the leadership of the Conservative Party, that he would take the Conservative Party out of this grouping because, quite plainly and simply, it was not consistent with his so-called views on being a Eurosceptic. By doing this, he secured the support in the parliamentary section of the leadership election of, we estimate, between 20 and 25 MPs who would not otherwise have voted for him. And here we are, 7 months later, and the Conservative Party is still in the EPP. And we are promised a statement by the Shadow Foreign Secretary at some stage in the next few weeks about what they will do. I was talking over this afternoon to various Conservative MPs who voted for Canada, and they are deeply distressed because they think that there will be a fudge, there will be a reneging on this agreement to get out. The trouble is, Cameron's already shown where he stands on Europe. He made it quite clear a few weeks ago that any member of his parliamentary party who avowed the need to leave the European Union would never get a front bench job. So much for internal party debate. As far as Dave is concerned, Europe is the default position. In his ridiculous statement today about having a Human Rights Act, he said he would have a Human Rights Act, but he would also retain the European Convention of Human Rights, which of course will prevent him from having a Human Rights Act. All this is indicative of the dishonesty and the cowardice, and I use that word deliberately, of the people who currently run the Conservative Party. They are entirely driven by focus groups. And these focus groups don't come into civilised, middle-class enclaves like Bromley and Chislehurst to get their views. They go among Liberal and Labour voters, and they say, well, what does the Tory party have to do to get you to vote for us? Now, I know what I would do if I were a Liberal or Labour voter asked by a focus group what would make me vote Conservative. I would say something so crackpot, so damaging, that I would hope that the Conservative Party would embrace those proposals and therefore lose to my party when the election next came up. And that, I think, is precisely what many of them are doing. Nonetheless, you have a condition now where all Dave can talk about is the need to change. Well, change into what? It seems from his A-list of candidates, this positive discrimination that his own people have been railing against, that the Conservative Party has to change into a bunch of failed actors and underwear models. Now, I don't want to think about Nigel in lingerie, but you can see that this wouldn't work with UKIP. What really offends me, though, and I know Nigel's been very strong on this in his campaign literature, is their commitment to public spending as a good in itself. Now, I'm entirely in favour of good public services. We all depend on them. It doesn't matter whether we're rich or poor. We all need roads, we all need hospitals, we all need schools. And even if we don't use the hospitals ourselves or don't send our children to the school, we depend on those things to keep our fellow men and women well and educated and to keep society going. So we all believe in strong public services. But you can have strong public services without squandering money on them. And this appears to be lost on the Conservative Party. Currently, the Labour government spends £520 billion a year in the public sector. I refuse to believe that with that amount of money being spent, greater value cannot be found. I refuse to believe that an incoming Conservative government couldn't cut the level of public spending while getting greater value and maintaining, indeed probably increasing, the level of public services. So you can have better hospitals, better schools, better policing, without having to keep putting up taxes. But instead of this, Dave says, if he gets elected, he's going to inherit Labour's levels of spending, and rather than cut them, he's promised very nobly to increase them, but more slowly than Labour would increase them. Now, we don't need to do this, and the main reason we don't need to do this is that Gordon Brown has spent billions of our money in the last 9 years creating his own client state, creating a group of people who will always have it in their interest to vote for him. 800,000 people have been put on the public payroll in this country since 1997. And most of them are pointless. Most of them are not policemen, they're not teachers, they're not doctors, they're not nurses, they're not people who look after the elderly in care homes, they're not people who care for distressed children or abandoned children. They are bureaucrats, they are monitors, they are people who are being paid an enormous amount of money to go around their respective fiefdoms checking that everybody else is doing their jobs. And I read an advertisement about a year ago which has stuck in my mind as an example of this cult of waste. It was for what used to be called Huntingdonshire. I think there is still a district council in Huntingdonshire. It's called Huntingdonshire. And it was at a salary of, I think, £45,000 a year, plus all the usual perks, plus a company car, to drive around GPs' surgeries in the Huntingdonshire Health District, going into their waiting rooms and giving out leaflets to people sitting in waiting rooms, advising them to eat more vegetables. Now, what really horrifies me is if there's someone in Huntingdonshire doing that, there's probably somebody everywhere else doing that. They've all got company cars, they've all got leaflets, they've all got a boss, and some of them may even have staff. Just think of what this sort of thing is costing our country. Now, the Conservative Party, when it comes into power, instead of saying, let's have an audit, let's go through the public sector from start to finish and work out whom we need and whom we don't need. Indeed, on a bigger scale, let's look at the role of the state. Let's try and work out what the state should do and what it shouldn't do, and see where we can save money so that we can put it into policemen and teachers and ambulance drivers and doctors and nurses and firemen and people that we actually need to do a socially useful job. Instead of saying that, they're saying, no, we have to maintain the status quo at least for the time being. And so, of course, they can't cut taxes. And they won't cut taxes because it means sacking people. It means sacking people obtusely who will never vote for them. They will never vote for them. Their parents, if they survive, will never vote for them. Their wives and children will never vote for them. Even their domestic pets will never vote for them. But they still insist on keeping these people on the public payroll. And they still insist on taxing us all to the hilt. It's all part, really, of this Euro fantasy that the Tories are still locked up in. In their Euromania, they still believe that there's a very small world out there in which we as a nation are just competing with the French and the Germans and the Italians, whose economies all happily happen to be in the tank by comparison with ours, and so therefore we can carry on with quite a cosy life. What they don't understand is that we're now competing with China and India and other economies in the developing world. China's growth rate this year is 9.6% compared with ours, which is about 2.2%, compared with France, which is 1.5%, compared with Germany's, which barely exists. By the year 2020, China will be the biggest exporter in the world. It will be exporting more than America and more than the whole of Europe put together. But we have taken a decision, or at least our political rulers of all main parties have taken a decision, that we just won't bother to compete with them. We'll just sit back and enjoy ourselves and live beyond our means. They don't understand that one of the most vital things for this country is a shift of resources back from the wasteful, unproductive public sector into the efficient, wealth-creating private sector. Now, what gives me great heart about reading Nigel's campaign literature is not just that as the UKIP candidate he is standing first and foremost for our liberation from the socialist corporatist state in Europe, and thank God he is, but that he also sees that there is a wider conservative agenda which someone has to pick up and run with. And full credit to him for doing so, because we need to be liberated not just from Europe, but from high taxes, from an oppressive and overweening state that is determined to interfere in all aspects of our life and to take money out of our pockets, to take bread out of the mouths of our children, to pay for an unnecessary social project that is failing and has manifestly failed. As I said to you earlier, and I will, before you all die bored and bring my remarks to a close, I always come to speak for him, and he always surprises me by getting an even bigger vote than I thought he would, and he always does very well. And I know because when I've been out campaigning with him, he is a man who even his opponents, and one of them was talking to me, not in this constituency, but someone who has fought against him in the past, said to me this afternoon, you can say what you like about Farage, and I often do, he said, you can say what you like about him, but he connects, he knows how to connect with the voters, and he does. And you see this in this campaign, when he goes onto the doorstep and he goes down the high street and he meets people. And so just think what it would mean for this constituency, for the people of Bromley and Chislehurst, to have him connecting in that way at Westminster, in the way that he has done so effectively in Strasbourg. I'm sure that many of you have been putting out leaflets and knocking on doors for him. And I would urge you, with every fibre of my being, in the next 3 days, go out there and try and get everybody you can to support him, because he is speaking for a very substantial majority of people in England who are disenfranchised. We had a turnout at the last general election of 60%. 4 people in 10 couldn't be bothered to vote. Now, in the old days, we used to think people didn't vote were the ones who went on holiday or the ones who were so out of it on drugs they couldn't be bothered to vote. They couldn't read and write, didn't know where they were. Those days have gone. There's now an enormous disenfranchised middle class, millions of people who say, I can't vote Labour because they are a socialist party, I can't vote Liberal Democrats because they've got people like Mark Oaten in them, I can't vote Conservative because they're not a Conservative party, I can't vote BNP because I'm not a racist and a fascist. So who am I going to vote for? Well, the answer is here. Here is a man who is, as he puts it, a member of the only non-sectarian, non-racist party that wants to get out of Europe. But that's where he starts. Every other one of his policies is something that most normal, rational, sensible people could endorse. And if he got elected, or even if he blooded the nose of some of the opposition parties, if he prevented a Conservative shoo-in in this seat, it would send a message back to Westminster, and particularly to the Conservative Party, that they cannot go on ignoring the mainstream people who were their core vote. They cannot go on treating the core vote with contempt. In the old days, the core vote had nowhere else to go. Now, the core vote has somewhere to go. And I hope in the next 3 days you will be going around this constituency with as much effort as you can possibly put in and saying to those people, you have a home to go to, it's called UKIP, it's called Nigel Farage, vote for him on Thursday. Thank you very much.
That's something you won't read in the newspaper, I'm afraid to say. It's very unfortunate that we don't get the sort of press and television coverage that we ought to. People don't understand what we're doing, and there are not enough people prepared to read what we're actually doing. We try and hand out leaflets and a little bit, no thank you, no thank you. What are they frightened of, for goodness sake? They're only going to read about something, but there we are. Well, I'm going to hand over now to the real article, and I have to say that as the chairman of the local branch, we begged Nigel to stand for us, because unfortunately I stood last year against Eric Ford, and he increased his majority. So we knew I was the wrong person, but what we did know is that we have an absolute champion, somebody who comes from the Bromley borough, who's the most fantastic speaker that we have in UKIP. I'm sorry to say it to some of the others, but he's somebody we always go to the conferences for. So hear Nigel, and ladies and gentlemen, you are now going to hear Nigel.
Well, Mr. Chairman, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming towards the end of a really very busy 3.5 weeks. Although, those of you that read today's front page of the Daily Telegraph, of course, may be aware that perhaps we're going to have to run the whole thing again, because it looks like the Conservative Party candidate's nomination may well be declared invalid, and we're currently awaiting a legal opinion on this. So for those of you that thought you'd seen enough of political leaflets to get you through to the next general election, you may be in for a shock. I have to thank Simon for his very kind words, and yes, you have spoken to me on many occasions, and thank you for doing that. But I also want to thank those of you here in the audience who over the last few weeks, those of you that live in the Bromley area, those of you that have come in from outside, for all your hard work. This has, without any shadow of a doubt, been the biggest and the best UKIP by-election campaign that we've fought in the party's history, and it's thanks to your hard work and shoe leather that we've got as far as we have today. And I particularly want to thank, and this may surprise some people, but I particularly want to thank the half a dozen people that have come here to help me in this campaign, who've come all the way from Malta. It makes me laugh when I listen to Peter Hain and people like this who say, oh, well, UKIP, they're just little Englanders. But I went 3 times to Malta to campaign for them to reject membership of the European Union. and by the narrowest of margins, and having been given a pack of lies and a mass of European money and Maltese taxpayers' money, by the narrowest of margins, the Maltese joined the European Union, and the thanks that I've got for doing that is they're here helping me. And that really is the point. You see, it's Britain's role to give a lead to the rest of Europe, because I'm certain that as soon as Britain gets herself out of political union, re-establishes a sensible trading arrangement, re-establishes good neighbourly contacts, I'm convinced that we'll be followed in short order by the Austrians, the Danes, the Finns, the Maltese and many others. And wouldn't that be a better, happier Western Europe for us all to live in? Yeah. Where we're sovereign states. So why am I standing in this by-election? Well, our chairman David made the point that I'm local. That's true. He also made the point that they begged me to do it, which would probably have been a reason for me not to. But I'm standing in this by-election because of the current state of British politics. If you look at the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrats, I challenge you to put a cigarette paper between them on the big issues of the day. They're all the same. As we say in UKIP, the choice at the next general election will be between New Labour and Blue Labour. And that just about sums it up, doesn't it? And I'm standing in this by-election because I'm conscious that there is virtually nobody out of our 646 men and women that represent us in Westminster who has got the courage to stand up and to say the right thing. Not cowed by political correctness, not concerned by the ludicrous focus groups that Simon spoke about earlier, and someone with the courage to speak up for England and for the English people. That is why I'm standing in this by-election, because I do not see anybody in those three main parties here in Bromley prepared to do that. And this campaign, as it's moved on through the weeks, it's proved to me that I was right. Because what have we seen? We've seen a campaign that's been fought on local issues. Now, I'm not saying that local issues don't matter. I pay council tax in Bromley as well, and there are plenty of things to be unhappy about. But isn't the point that we discussed local issues, we voted on local issues in May of this year in the Bromley Borough local elections? Yet all they can talk about are local issues. And when they're not discussing local issues, they sink to very petty personal attacks upon each other, don't they? You've all seen the literature. The Liberal Democrats have been attacking Bob Neal. They've been putting distorted photographs of him on their election literature. I think there are far more important reasons to attack Bob Neal than personal ones, such as the fact that he sits on the Committee of the Regions in Brussels, an organisation that intends to break England up into 9 separate parliaments and to literally wipe England off the face of the map. These are the kind of things that should have been discussed in this by-election, but they haven't. They don't want to discuss the real issues, but we do, I do, and that's what this whole campaign has been all about. And there's no question that number one on our list, and number one amongst the thoughts of the people living in the Bromley and Chislehurst constituency, is the chaotic shambles that Britain's current immigration policy is. This isn't a question of whether you come from the right of centre, whether you come from the centre, whether you come from the left of centre. This is a question of 1/3 of a million people a year net coming into this country. The estimates for next year are that it'll be 500,000 people net that come into the country. And if we go on and admit countries like Turkey, then goodness only knows where we're heading in a few years' time. And yet, our 3 traditional political parties refuse to discuss it. And I think it's essential that UKIP is here. I think it's important that UKIP has put immigration as our #1 campaigning issue here, because if honest, decent people aren't prepared to stand up and talk about this issue, then we give the ground, don't we, to the BNP, which is the last thing we should want in the interests of us and the ethnic minorities living in our country. That is the vital job that UKIP's got to do, and I trust that has the support of every one of you in this hall this evening. Now, when I say chaotic shambles, it is, isn't it? Because it is estimated that there are currently 570,000 illegal immigrants living in Britain. And the government's solution is to give them all an amnesty. Now, what kind of message does that send to the rest of the world? It says that Britain's a soft touch, doesn't it? It says that Britain is not prepared to stand up and do anything. But you won't have heard much, of course, from the Conservative Party about this. Because with Labour in power in 1994, they themselves gave an amnesty to 230,000 illegal immigrants. And the one thing that really has got under their skin, it's upset Labour in Bromley, it's upset the Liberal Democrats in Bromley, but by jingo, it's really upset Bob Neal, is you may have seen driving through Bromley, well in fact you could hardly fail to have noticed driving through Bromley, there are some rather large billboards posted up around the constituency, and rather fun that we nipped in when the campaign started and booked the billboards, so that none of the other parties have got any billboards in this campaign at all. But I make the point on the billboards that Bob Neal, the Conservative Party candidate, supports unlimited immigration. Now, he got very upset about this, and he huffed and he puffed, and he sent a letter to my agent, Steve Allison, saying that unless the billboards were removed, unless all the campaign material that refers to this was destroyed, that he would take us to the High Court and place an injunction on us. And we thought about this threat to our campaign. We pondered it for all minutes and minutes and minutes before telling him effectively where to go. Of course, he didn't take us to the High Court. He didn't seek an injunction. And the reason is, and the truth that needs to be out there, and the truth that he won't talk about, and Labour won't talk about, and the Liberal Democrats most certainly won't talk about, is that if you are members of a European Union, there are unlimited free movement of peoples between those countries. And the reason that Bob Neal in particular was so sensitive about this is that those three candidates all support the entry of Bulgaria and Romania into the European Union from the 1st of January next year. That will mean, and this is the estimate from Migration Watch, headed up by Sir Andrew Green, that will mean an extra 1/3 people in the first year alone, on top of the 1/3 that are coming into Britain already. And my view on that is you only have to look at the roads and the traffic. You only have to look at the pressure on housing stock. You only have to look at the pressure on water to realise that it is simply absolute madness, a total irresponsibility to have an open-door, unlimited immigration policy to countries that are very much poorer than ours. It is madness, and yet I'm the only candidate standing up in this by-election and saying it, and I think on the back of that one policy alone, Mr. Chairman, we will get a lot of votes this Thursday. And what about crime? What about law and order? Something that really does impact not just in Bromley, but frankly in every city and every market town right across this country. Well, from the off, on our literature we wrote that we want to abolish the Human Rights Act, we want to get rid of the European Convention on Human Rights, because however well intended this legislation may be, it has turned into being a criminal's charter. Now that's been very popular on the doorsteps. That's been very popular as we've been leafleting in the marketplaces. And I think that David Cameron's statement this morning may well have had something to do with the fact that his own campaign here in Bromley is crumbling as we begin to hit the target with policy after policy after policy. But as Simon said, what he's come up with is sheer, absolute nonsense, isn't it? Yeah. A British Bill of Rights, but accepting at the same time the primacy of the European courts over the British courts. And doesn't this get to the nub of all of it? Isn't the essential thing that we are able as a nation to vote for the men and women that make our laws, and that once every 4 or 5 years we have the opportunity at election time to turf the rascals out and to replace them with somebody else with a different manifesto, and that the highest arbiter of those laws are our own British courts. So we've been campaigning on human rights, we've been campaigning on the European Convention on Human Rights, but we've also been talking about the scandal that is the current prison service in this country. It simply beggars belief, doesn't it? When you read day after day after day of serious murderers, of child abusers, of people like this who are let out of prison having served perhaps a third to a half of their sentence and then reoffend. And we've campaigned in this by-election. We've cited America. In America, violent crime has halved in the last 20 years. In the United Kingdom, violent crime has doubled in the last 20 years. And the lesson from America is that you have in society, albeit a very tiny percentage, but you have in society a number of people who, however nice you are to them, however many colour televisions you put in their cells, however much you help to rehabilitate them back into society, they will be persistent, habitual reoffenders. And that the answer is not to say that our prisons are full, therefore people must serve shorter sentences. The answer is to build more prisons and to put repeat offenders. And nowhere has this message been more strongly received than in the Labour heartlands. In the Labour heartlands in this constituency, where people's lives are absolutely blighted by the drugs trade and crime. And we've also campaigned in this Bromley by-election, again on our own, because the others don't wish to discuss it. We've campaigned on tax, on the burden of tax, on the current level of taxation, pointing out to people that the tax burden in Britain is now higher than it is in Germany. Something that we couldn't have even contemplated 10 or 15 years ago. And so one of the main policies here on tax has been to say it's about time that inheritance tax was abolished. The super rich, the very rich, the people living in 1, 2, 3 and 4 million pound houses don't pay inheritance tax anyway. They've all got good financial consultants, they've all got Isle of Man trust companies. The rich don't pay inheritance tax. Inheritance tax is now being paid by ordinary families. Millions of them. Ordinary families. And what's happening is that you'll find a man and woman, they buy a house, they take out a 25-year mortgage, they work their whole lives to pay the mortgage off, they die thinking they're leaving their children some assets, and in fact what they're leaving their children is a massive tax bill and a huge legal headache. So getting rid of inheritance tax, we think, would be a very good thing to do. But even more important than that, what we have got to do in this country is we have got to help those at the lower end of society. We've got to help them to get out of the dependency culture. And so many times over the last few weeks I've met people who've said, look, we both work, we've got 2 children, but actually we'd be better off if we lived on the social. We'd be better off not working. Isn't that madness? Isn't the idea of a welfare state, isn't the idea of the public services that Simon talked about earlier, isn't the idea of this that you provide in a civilised society a safety net to help people that are in trouble? Actually, what I'm beginning to see with our system is that we're using this as a barrier to stop people from getting on and getting out in the world. So we have got to raise the tax threshold and raise it substantially. And we've got to make sure that we don't fall back into the terrible trap of the 1970s. Do you remember when many of our brightest and best were leaving the United Kingdom, weren't they? They'd go through school, university, and off they'd go to Australia, New Zealand, America, wherever they'd go, because incentives had been taken away. And once again, it beggars belief that not just the Conservative Party, it beggars belief that the electorate in this country are simply not being given a choice on an issue as important as taxation. So we campaign on all of these things, but of course, above all, the point that we make at this election, we've made at every election we've fought, and will go on making, is that the key to all of this is, are we governing ourselves or not? I think it's quite absurd that we listen to the Today programme, we watch the news, and we see the tireless Dave Cameron coming up with these new slogans, you know, vote blue, go green, and all the rest of it, talking about how environmentally friendly the Conservative Party are. And then the next day you get Gordon Brown on a couch somewhere on a daytime TV show saying that no, actually, he's more environmentally friendly than David Cameron. But this is a completely absurd, false debate. These people jolly well know, but won't tell you, that the fact is that 100% of our environmental legislation is not now made by Westminster, it is made by the European Union, and there's not a single thing we can do about it. This is the kind of honesty that we've got to get back into British politics. And the very fact that over 70% of our laws are now made in the European Union, proposed by the unelected European Commission, is something that doesn't just stick in the craw with UKIP members. There's now a majority, a clear majority of the British public out there that have simply had enough of it. And it is only by coming out of political union, re-establishing our ability to trade, not just with our European neighbours, but with our Commonwealth partners as well. I mean, India, growth rates of 8% last year, maybe just behind China, but India, a massive economy, a booming economy, a country with whom we still have some very special ties, and yet we're not allowed to have a trade deal with India. Britain, the world's third largest nation, is not allowed to do that deal because these things are all done for us by our masters in Brussels. And in this particular case, of course, by that wonderful British Commissioner. I think the man, our best ever candidate that we've sent to the European Union, the man that fits in beautifully there, yes, of course, I'm talking about Peter Mandelson. But it's only by getting back the ability to govern our own country, to make our own laws, to have our own trade deals. It's only by doing that that I think we can regain something else that is more valuable than that previous list. And that is our self-confidence and our pride in who we are, and our absolute determination that we will leave our children and grandchildren a country that they can call their own. That's what this campaign is. I sense in parts of this constituency, I sense when I'm going around Mottingham, I sense when I'm going around Bromley Common, I sense when I'm walking up Chislehurst High Street, that in the course of the last 4 or 5 days, something quite unusual, something quite exciting is beginning to happen in this constituency. I don't doubt for a moment that UKIP's support has doubled over the course of the last 5 days as people begin to make their minds up. I'm not sure just what we can achieve between now and Thursday, but I do know something. The establishment have really got the wind up. They've got the wind up because this party is now better organised than it's ever been before. And they've really got the wind up because we're the only people talking about the issues that matter to real people, and we're beginning to hit the target. And I urge you, I beg you, do please for this campaign, not for me, but for this campaign, for what this campaign stands for your country, for goodness sake, do what you can for us over the course of the next 3 days, and we'll have a hell of a party after that. Thank you.
I'm not going to follow that, but what I can tell you is that if you're with Nigel at 6 o'clock in the morning at any one of the railway stations, you will see how he always manages to engage in the right person. He's got that much energy and understanding. When you're out with him during the day, he always manages to speak to the right people. He seems to know them. And when you're there at nearly 9 o'clock at night, still canvassing, he can still, when you get a relatively positive, he's there beside you, and he's handing the literature over, and he takes the whole thing over, and you've got another convert that's come back again. That's what this man can do. I've seen him. Now, we also, tonight, are privileged to have a former Member of Parliament, somebody who was a friend of Eric Forth, a man who actually fought against Margaret Thatcher and was one of the first people to actually stand up and be counted. And what I'm talking about is Mr. John Brown, the former MP from Winchester. Mr. Brown, would you please stand up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. I think having heard those two speeches, I'm personally filled with enthusiasm, and I have to say, and you all probably feel the same, what a candidate! I flew in here this morning from the United States of America, where I live, and it's a long way from Florida. I am thrilled to be here to support Nigel this week. I am absolutely thrilled to be with you, because I believe this night in this hall, we're not going to watch history, we're writing it. Because I really, truly believe Nigel's going to win. I really believe that. And a thrill for me to come from America to join in what Simon said was a hammer blow. A hammer blow against the chains of tyranny. The chains of tyranny of the European Union is a thrill indeed, and I think it is for every man and woman in this country. Now, I was a Member of Parliament, as your Chairman said, for just under 15 years. Some of my close friends are members of UKIP. Roger Natman, Christopher Gill, and of course, the late Eric Forth. He wasn't UKIP, but I have to tell you this, and I like in that he to me was a great Member of Parliament, a great parliamentarian in addition to that, and most of all, a great patriot, and he was a great friend, as many of you will know. And in the words of John Lennon's song, I'd like you to imagine, but actually to me, it doesn't take much imagination. I can hear Eric now, up there, saying, "Hear, hear," to Simon Heffer's speech. "Hear, hear, hear," to our candidate's speech. And I hear him saying to you, the good people of Bromley and Chislehurst, if you believe in Bromley and Chislehurst, if you believe in the United Kingdom, if you believe in the betterment of the people of Europe in general, as Nigel hinted, our example, then there is only one candidate that you should back, and that is Nigel Farage.
What a pity that there aren't more people from Bromley. dear. It's such a shame, isn't it? Right, now we're going on to questions, and obviously to try and do it in a nice orderly fashion, I'll be sitting in the middle, and as I see hands go, I'll indicate to you that I'm going to call you next, so that we, as much as possible, get as much said as you want this evening, so that everybody goes away from here totally satisfied that they've got all the answers they need. Right, let's have the first hand up, please. The gentleman at the back there, thank you very much. Sir.
Could I please, my name is Eagles, and I come from Southampton. Could I please ask Simon Heffer if on Friday and Thursday's Mail and Telegraph we see a headline, people of Bromley have the chance to make history. Vote Nigel Farage.
A miracle! By an oversight, I don't own the Daily Telegraph, or indeed edit it. I'm here in a personal capacity. I don't make the editorial policy of the paper, the editor does that in consultation with the people who own it. I think you will have noticed, however, that we have not swallowed the Dave Cameron line entirely. We ran a leader this morning, which I knew nothing about, was I guess today off, being a Sunday, condemning the Cameron human rights speech and pointing out how stupid it was. So I think that our paper sends a message, but when we've been in existence for 151 years, and for about 130 of those years we've been a conservative newspaper, and old habits die hard. But we're also a newspaper that allows its columnists, like me, I write twice a week, to vent our views without any let or hindrance. And I'm not censored, I never have been. It won't start now. It'll be quite clear in what I write between now and the by-election where I stand. It's been widely reported that I'm coming here tonight, and my newspaper was quite happy about that. There was no objection raised to it. I can't promise you there'll be a front page devoted on Thursday morning to advising the people to vote UKIP. But equally, I think you'll read the Daily Telegraph for a long time before you read any naked or open hostility towards either Nigel Farage or the party that he represents.
Good evening, Mr. Farage, and good evening, Mr. Heffer. My name is John Cartwright, and I'm standing as the official Monster Raving Looney Park candidate.
Nice to see you.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. We both agree on the need to withdraw from the European Union, but I've got a number of various policy differences with you, which is why I'm standing separately. My question is about the electoral system. First past the post allows the government to force through any laws it likes by using its large parliamentary majority and by bullying its own MPs with its whips, without proper scrutiny or consideration, on the basis of only 35% of the votes. Proportional representation, specifically by the single transferable vote method, would give the voters a wide choice of candidates at election time, ensure proper scrutiny of legislation before it gets enacted, and also would keep small local constituencies and therefore prevent the election of too many small minorities like the BNP. So why does the UKIP want to bring democracy back home to the UK from the EU, but not also strengthen and improve democracy at home with proportional representation?
Thank you.
Can I say how delighted I am to see you here this evening, because it takes me back a little bit, right to the start of the UK Independence Party. UKIP was formed on the 3rd of September 1993, and within 5 weeks of the party being formed, the Conservative member for Eastleigh, Mr. Stephen Milligan, died in very unusual circumstances. Possibly the first ever case of vitamin C poisoning, for those that remember the case. So there was to be a by-election, and it was a brand new party, and I said, well, I don't know, I fancy having a go at that. So I was UKIP's first ever candidate, and I stood in that Eastleigh by-election, and it was a hell of a by-election. It was the first or second, I think, of the big Lib Dem victories from the Tories in the south. And I remember arriving that evening for the count, and it had been a really very brutal couple of months as far as I was concerned. I'd never stood for anything before. I mean, nobody in UKIP had a clue what we were doing. But I remember arriving at the hall, and after a few minutes there, I met the founder of your party, Screaming Lord David Such, who was also running in that by-election. I think it was his 40th or 41st by-election, and we met, and after a few minutes he said, "Nigel, I'll tell you what, why don't you and I go to the bar and have a drink? I don't like the other lot very much." And we had a very convivial evening together, and I remember having to be terribly careful getting up the steps onto the platform just to make sure nothing went wrong. So I'm delighted to see you, John, here this evening. But I want to make a point. Isn't it interesting? Isn't it sad that this is the only open political meeting that is taking place throughout the whole of this by-election campaign? Isn't that terrible? I'm delighted that you're here. We would have been delighted, within reason, Mr. Chairman, for anybody to come along to this meeting and to ask questions. It's an essential part, it seems to me, of what democracy is all about. To your question, I believed for some time that the first past the post system was the right system because it gave not just stable government, but it gave the important link between the Member of Parliament and the constituents. And I had that view for many, many years. However, I think that view and that system has now fallen into disrepute because we have a Prime Minister elected with just 24% of the nation's votes, who has been able to best part dismantle the British Constitution and is the nearest thing to an elected dictator that this country has ever seen. And so something has to be done, because it's not serving us well. And there is this feeling out there, isn't there, that if you're a socialist living in Esher, there isn't much point voting, and if you're a conservative living in Sheffield, there isn't much point voting. And I think we have to have, and sooner rather than later, some proportional element within the House of Commons at Westminster. We simply cannot go on as we are. The difficulty, of course, as with all these discussions, is which particular form of PR would you go for. But I think that something like 75% of the seats being decided on the current first-past-the-post formula, retaining that essential link between the person and the constituency, and then the other 25% on a top-up list, which would mean that nobody with 24% of the vote could do what Blair has done, and would mean that parties like UKIP would have a good, solid representation within the House of Commons. So yes, I agree with you, we are in need of electoral reform, but we mustn't, of course, put the cart before the horse, because frankly, all the while over 70% of our legislation is being decided somewhere else, then frankly, fiddling around with our own internal arrangements isn't really what matters. The first thing to do is to get our country back from the clutches of Brussels, and we can only do that by not voting for the very three political parties that sold us out in the first place.
It's been very noticeable over the last year or so how many prominent people who in recent years have felt constrained about saying what they really think about the European Union are now standing up publicly and saying that they have to leave. Obvious names are Ruth Lee, the 8 MPs who signed the Better Off Out campaign, many other people who have signed the Better Off campaign. The one that surprised me perhaps most of all was last Friday when Lord Deeds wrote in the Telegraph that after thinking ever since the war, or ever since the EU started, that whatever the problems the EU actually presented, it was still preferable to another war. He actually wrote that he now is beginning to believe that the EU itself will cause civil war. My only query is, I suppose, what took him so long? Two questions. How important in this overall fight is it that these prominent people are now finally coming out of the closet? And what can we do to encourage more?
I mean, certainly when I let my paper know I was coming down here tonight in a private and personal capacity to speak for Nigel, no one raised an eyebrow. I think if I'd done it 10 years ago, if I'd been the associate editor of the paper then and I wanted to do it, I think that they might have raised more than one eyebrow. UKIP is a mainstream, respectable, serious party. The fact that so many people like you are here tonight, even if we are all racists, closet or otherwise, fruitcakes and loonies, the fact that you're all here tonight and you're not foaming at the mouth and not burning people at the stake does suggest that UKIP has arrived. And I think it is easier now for people who, as you say, hold some prominent position in public to come out and say that the fundamental issue is, are we or are we not going to have our own sovereignty? Are we going to be masters of our own destiny? Or are we going to capitulate to rule by a foreign power? And I think people have worked out at last, and it has taken a long time in Bill Deeds' case, 93 years. It has taken a long time to realise that everything in the European garden is not fabulously rosy. We were duped in the early 1970s by Heath, or at least some of us were. I don't want to be holier than thou, but as a 14-year-old schoolboy in March 1975, or May 1975, I went around campaigning for the No campaign in the referendum. My own anti-Europeanism has been absolutely consistent for 30 years, even before I had the vote. And I have written many times in the newspapers that I wish we would leave the EU. And I have never changed my view on that one jot or tittle. It was almost the only thing I held against Mrs. Thatcher, whom I revered by a few other women when she was Prime Minister, that she wouldn't have the guts to say that she would get out. And of course the point that Nigel made is right. You know, you have a Conservative candidate here who, by the fact of his complicity in the European project, is in favour not merely of unlimited immigration, but is in favour of the eradication of this nation from the map. Now, I mean, this is Mr. Ahmadinejad by other means, isn't it? You know, he wants to wipe out a country from the map by using nuclear weapons. This man wants to use a nuclear weapon of removing our sovereignty. I don't want to be a region. I'm English. I want to be England. I want to live in England. I want to have an English Parliament working out where I'm going and with my English representatives in it. I don't want to be ruled by some person sitting in a regional authority somewhere with no power. With no power to stop it. What I feel will happen is, as these offences against our democracy become more and more blatant, then more people with a public position will say it. It will start on the right. People like Ruth Lee and me are obviously natural Tories. We've realised that the party that we once belonged to and once subscribed to does not defend our interests. Happily, we have this sensible, reasonable, mainstream party in UKIP that is prepared to defend our interests. It's a pity, really, that those 8 MPs who signed the Better Off Out statement won't all cross the floor and join UKIP and become a UKIP party. After all, they've all been told by their leader that they have no future in their own party. So why not make the most of the next 3 or 4 years before a general election and sit for a party where they really will be taken seriously and where they can have an effect on the future of this country. You know, there's been a great pretense in the mainstream parties over the years that Europe is non-negotiable and that what Europe suggests is non-negotiable. I mean, so you talk about a civil war. I remember having a conversation on a television programme 10 or 12 years ago with Ken Clark about the single European currency. And I said to him, Ken, tell me this. At the moment, when you stand for election, if anybody doesn't like the economic policy of your party, they can have the safety valve of voting for one that has a different economic policy. But if we go into a European single currency, then there won't be any economic policies other than the one that's dictated from the central bank in Frankfurt. The Labour Party's policy, if it gets into government, will have to be the same as the Conservative Party's policy if it gets into government. And so I said to him, what is going to be left? What can people do? All they can do is riot. And Ken said, oh, it won't come to that. Well, he was right, it didn't. Because we didn't go into the single currency, at least not yet. So there is this blindness among people, but I think it's coming down. And more people who are, to use a really ghastly phrase, opinion formers, are now saying, actually, the European thing isn't that wonderful. What do we do to encourage more of them? I think people like Nigel, in prominent positions in UKIP, do a fantastic job in encouraging these people by showing that he's not a fruitcake, and he's not a loony, and he's certainly not a closet racist or any other sort of racist. He's just a normal, straightforward, straight up and down, patriotic, decent, sensible Englishman who wants his country to be governed from Westminster.
You're absolutely right, Simon, though I do intend on Thursday to show Bob Neal and David Cameron that gadflies are capable of biting. The question about public figures, commentators, coming out and saying, look, it's time we re-established our independence, it is vital that we have important public figures doing this. And it was part of UKIP's success story in the run-up to the European elections of 2004. If you remember, we had 3 dukes, including the Duke of Devonshire, that became patrons of the party, and suddenly Sterling Moss was supporting the party, and Geoffrey Boycott was supporting the party, and Joan Collins was supporting the party, and then a former TV daytime presenter came along and supported the party. A chap by the name of Kilroy, which all goes to prove you can have too much of a good thing.
I've been working for UKIP for a long while now. What surprises me, nothing much is being said about the regional assemblies authority over local councils. And I think it's really diabolical the way that the councils are being eradicated.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I absolutely agree with that, and we both touched on that a little bit this evening. But I think there's a bigger question, a much wider question about local democracy. You know, it isn't just the powers that have been taken away from local district councils and county councils and have gone to the regional assemblies. It's also the extent to which county councils and district councils are so dependent now upon the centre that during the 1980s, you know, Mrs. Thatcher effectively emasculated local government in Britain. She did it because she so hated the Red Ted Knights in Lambeth and the loony left. But I actually think it was one of her bigger mistakes. Yeah. And I think we've got to get rid of uniform business rates. I think we've got to get rid of the situation where 80% of local government funding comes from the centre. I'd like to see local government raising its own revenue, spending its own revenue, and it refers back a little bit to John's point earlier, we need not just to get our country back from Brussels, we need to reinvigorate our own democracy. So yes, of course, we've got to get rid of the regional assemblies, but once we've done that, let's make local politics, let's make standing for local elections, let's make voting in local elections really matter again.
My question relates to the open door immigration policy. David Cameron issued a canard against UKIP members by calling them closet racists. I would like to ask you whether you could highlight the social problems that are caused by this open door immigration policy. In particular, for example, the rise of political extremism, such as the National Front. We have one of these undesirable standing in this election. It is his right, but I think it is a perfect example of problem that occurs when you do have an open door policy so thoughtlessly.
Well, yes, I mean, you're absolutely 100% right in what you say. Our three traditional parties are too frightened, too constrained by political correctness to even discuss this issue. And of course, the last thing they want the public to know is that the big rise in immigration figures is directly because of European Union membership. That's the truth. They simply don't want to tell you. But we have got to make this point, that you do not need to be racist or extremist or prejudiced to stand up and openly and honestly discuss immigration policy and control of one's own borders. And if UKIP doesn't do this, doesn't do it vigorously, doesn't do it well, then we literally will leave the field open for the BNP. And I hope that we score a massive result in this Bromley by-election, having made it clear in our literature and all through the campaign that we're not frightened of talking about this issue. And if we succeed in Bromley, having done that, then the BNP will be history. Wouldn't that be a good thing to do on Thursday?
Yeah. John first, gentleman behind him, the lady next. Thank you. Up come John.
Mr Farage, we know that you will be an active campaigner against our membership and the insidious benefits, in inverted commas, that flow from it. But if you win a seat in Westminster, what are the three main platforms do you think you will campaign on? Or alternatively, which are the three main areas do you think you will be most effective in campaigning?
I think it's important when standing for any election not to make promises that afterwards you're not going to be able to fulfil. And I think that the vast majority of the public have seen through that now. You know, they hear somebody standing for election and giving this big wish list of the things they're going to do and they're going to achieve, and they fall up short, don't they, every time? And so disenchantment with politics follows every time. This election on Thursday is not, of course, about choosing the next government. You know, nobody in Bromley can get rid of Tony Blair on Thursday, though that might be a rather good thing to do. But they haven't got that opportunity. All they can do is to vote for one man or woman to be the representative for Bromley. And what I would seek to do, I would seek to be a voice. I would seek to speak up, not just for those people who felt this way in Bromley, but frankly, for the millions of people across this country who have got nobody in Westminster to speak up for them. So that is the only promise, the only election promise I'm making to anybody, is if I go to Westminster, I will stand up and be a voice for you, and above all, I will campaign, of course, for independence. I will campaign for a smaller state. I take the view that whether you want to smoke cigarettes, hunt foxes, or ride fast motorbikes, preferably not all at the same time, but if you want to do those things, that should be for you to decide, and not for the state to decide whether you should be allowed to do it. And the third thing that I would campaign for, if I was successful on Thursday and was there in Westminster, I would campaign for a much more modern outlook, and I use that word sensibly, a more modern outlook to the way Britain sees herself in the world. Because I think we are falling behind in every way, and we're doing so because of the Eurocentric thinking of our politicians and of our civil servants. And if Britain is to be a happy, successful, vibrant democracy through the 21st century, it's about time we woke up to the fact that we're living in a global economy, not just a little European backyard.
So, gentlemen, to go first, and then you're next. Thank you.
Local question. Yes. I'm sure you're going to find it very difficult to answer. Where are the police in Bromley?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I haven't quite got to the bottom of this. I don't understand why there are 600 police in Beckenham and there are 600 police in Orpington, and there are only 400 police in Bromley. I haven't yet managed to work this out. Of course, your GLA representative, who serves on the police committee, is Mr. Bob Neal, and had he had a public meeting this evening, you could have gone along and asked him that question, though I suspect he's in hiding somewhere, trying to avoid the public. So I don't know the answer to your question, but one thing is absolutely clear, that having police out there on the beat is a genuine deterrent, and there is a shortage of police on the beat, not just in Bromley, but frankly right across the country. And it seems to me that the police force has caught this modern day British disease of bureaucracy, where there are many more of them filling in forms in offices than actually out there on the beat doing their job. So we want to see more police on the beat, but we also have to unshackle them, don't we, by getting rid of this ridiculous human rights legislation, whereby the police simply don't know, when dealing with yobs, exactly what they are allowed to do or are not allowed to do, because each case under this legislation is down to the subjective interpretation of the judge that happens to be sitting. So yes, I'm with you, more police. Yes, we've got to give them the powers to do the job. And if I'm elected on Thursday, as a #1 local priority, I will try and find out where the missing 200 policemen are.
I can have a word with you afterwards because I'm involved with the police and I have some answers I can give you. Lady here, please.
Excuse me if I don't stand up.
That's fine.
First of all, we're established that we want to get out of the European Union. How do we get out of it? That's #1. Second question is, having established that the Human Rights Act is useless, what will be put in its place of the fail-safe?
Well, I'll do the first part and you the second part. Whatever you like. Okay. How do we get out? I mean, this is amazing, isn't it? This is amazing that we have in the 1970s and the 1980s, we have the leading politicians in the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Party as they were then, saying, look, join up with this European club. There's absolutely nothing to fear at all. It's simply about friendship and free trade, and you can trust us. You know, that nothing more will come of it. And then I remember seeing Douglas Hurd being interviewed in the early 1990s when he was asked the question, well, what if Britain would want to leave the European Union at some point in the future? And Hurd said, oh no, that's not possible. And I remember feeling like sort of punching the front of the television screen here, thinking they've told us a pack of lies and got us in, and told us that we can't come out. Of course, there's no such word as can't, is there? There's no such word as can't if you have the weight of public opinion behind you, and actually, coming out of this thing is terribly easy. All that you have to do is to repeal the piece of legislation in Parliament that took us in, and that would be, in this case, the 1972 European Communities Act, and the subsequent amendments to it. It could all be done terribly quickly. I understand that the Abdication Act went through 3 readings of the Commons and Lords in 1936 within 16 hours. So when UKIP says we could be out of the European Union within 24 hours, I think it's something we can stand by. And then a British Prime Minister goes to Brussels to say, look, we don't want this treaty anymore, but we do want a constructive, friendly, open, new relationship where we can trade with each other, where we can cooperate together on things like North Sea pollution or whatever it may be. All of that is terribly simple. What is more difficult is the fact that since we've been part of this experiment, we've had to incorporate 101,000 pages of close-type legislation into British law. They call it the acquis communautaire. This is the thing that the small businessman moans about. These are the burdens being placed on British business. What we would have to do over the course of some period of time is to trawl through those 101,000 pages. Need a very patient person to do it, wouldn't it? And find out which parts of those legislation we think are generally fairly sensible, we would have done anyway, and will keep. And with the rest of it, you know, piece by piece by piece, get rid of it to lift that burden of business. So that part of it would take time. But the mechanism for us getting out, and the mechanism for us re-establishing a free trade agreement is all very simple and straightforward stuff. And I don't think you'll ever find a British politician in the Labour or Conservative Party ever again say what Douglas Hurd said. It was barely noticed in the early 1990s, but if it was said by somebody in 2006, I think the public would go mad.
As for the human rights law, we're all old enough to remember Britain before it had a human rights law. And I think we're all old enough to remember that it was not a country that was awash with injustices. People were not sitting in the streets protesting about terrible iniquities that had been inflicted upon them. The saloon bars of England were not heaving the conversations about the damage done to each individual person's human rights on that day. That was because we had things like Magna Carta, like the Bill of Rights of 1689, like the rule of law, like Acts of Parliament passed to protect people. And the trouble with human rights legislation is that it has actually created a framework to give preferential treatment to people who simply don't deserve it. Why should there be a mechanism in law now to allow convicted paedophiles to see pornography in prison? Why should there be a mechanism to allow someone who is in prison for a really serious crime to have the right to be moved to a jail nearer his own home because he is inconvenienced by it? And when I hear Cameron say that he wants to shift the burden from the guilty from the innocent to the guilty, to ensure that people who have done wrong against society or have offended against society in some way are not given these privileges, are not given this preferential treatment, but that those who suffer at their hands are allowed to see that those people are being properly punished. Well, of course we all agree with him. But when he then says in the next breath, but we're going to retain the European Convention of Human Rights, we know that any gestures made to deny these people their privileges will immediately be overturned by a foreign power or by the judges acting on behalf as a foreign power. Now that is unacceptable. Don't forget, France, Germany, Italy have only had the framework of laws that they have for the last 60 years. Spain has only had the framework of law that it has really since 1975, when the Franco era came to an end. Most countries in Eastern Europe have not had their own framework of laws for more than 10 or 15 years. Ours has been a continuous stream of law since the 11th century, since the Norman Conquest. Some of our common law dates back before that. We don't need to be regulated by foreign powers, many of whom only 60 years ago were acting in a barbaric way towards innocent and decent people. We don't need to be regulated by them and be told by them how we administer the laws of our country. There is no country in Europe that has a better record in the last 100 years of defending the rights and liberties, not merely of its own people, but of people in other countries whose rights and liberties have been threatened, than this country. So the answer to your question of what would replace the Human Rights Act if we get rid of it is our own canon of law, which worked perfectly well for decades and for centuries, and which we should never have surrendered. It was a symbol of our loss of self-confidence as a nation, that we felt that we needed to have some external umpire judging our laws for us and judging whether or not we could do certain things. These decisions must be taken by our legislators, passing acts of parliament that they have been elected by our people to put onto the statute book. And there is no finer safeguard of individual rights than that.
One final question from the gentleman at the back, because unfortunately we don't have the hall all night. Sir.
I've listened very carefully to what you've said this week. Disturbingly, I failed to find anything I disagree with. So, what can we do between now and Thursday?
Well, what we need are bodies and people. We need people to help us on Thursday get the vote out, man polling stations, drive cars to pick up elderly and disabled people that want to go out and vote UKIP. We need people to supervise leafleting teams. I mean, listen, as many hours as you can give us, sir, between now and 10 p.m. on Thursday we can use, and to make that work we have as you leave this evening, there are tables there, there are people there taking names, addresses and telephone numbers, and please, however little or however much you can do between now and Thursday. We have fought a fantastic campaign to get into the position that we are now. What we now must do is maximise on that between now and 10 p.m. on Thursday, and we need troops on the ground. So if you support the things that you've heard tonight, if you feel that I'm the only candidate standing in this by-election saying what most people think, then please give us your name and phone number on the way out and help us during this last 72 hours. It could make a huge difference. Thank you.
We do have posters available if you'd like to take them there. If you wanted to join, we also have people who will take your name and address down. We're very keen to get any help we can so that Thursday turns out to be our victory day. But first of all, to thank you all for coming. It's only any good. If an audience come and an audience take part, that's when you get a good meeting. And you've been a very good audience, and I thank you for that very much indeed. You were all very welcome. Thank you. Good night.